All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Reimagining Executive Transitions. We're so glad you're with us today. I know for certain that we have a very rich conversation in front of us because we've been planning it and learning so much from one another. Thanks for being here. The subtitle of this webinar is very purposeful. It's a candid discussion of harmful assumptions and powerful possibilities. My name is Jean. I coordinate these leadership webinars for Nonprofit Quarterly. Welcome, everybody. And if you'd like to just get started, we use the Q&A for upvoting each other's comments and talking to one another. So feel welcome to drop where you're calling in from. And at Liz's suggestion, one of our panelists, if you want to start thinking about a word or two that comes to mind for you when you even think or feel the words executive transition, you're welcome to start thinking about that and putting it in the Q&A. I want to briefly, as I always do, just remind you that today's webinar is part of a leadership membership program at NPQ that's got a number of components to it. Not only these monthly leadership webinars that we curate for you, but also a digital subscription to the magazine, which has really never been better under the leadership of our editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez. You see some of the recent issues there on the right. A digital subscription to the magazine, access to all of our archives, etc. So if you're not yet a member and want to think about that, you can see the membership in the upper right-hand corner on the homepage. To those of you who are already members, thank you. Thanks for being here. And a little bit about today's logistics. This is a 90-minute session. We always record the sessions, so you will get the slides and a recording in a few days from NPQ. I'm also going to include in that follow-up email any resources that Juliet or Kiara or Liz mention during the session, so you'll get a little bit of a follow-up reading list as well. As I mentioned already, we use the Q&A box because you can talk to each other in there and upvote each other's questions, and I'll be kind of moderating that as our speakers move through the session. If you're on Twitter and want to share some insights, there's our NP Quarterly handle, and I'll share our speakers' handles in a moment. And I'm asking you now to make a commitment to stay for 30 seconds as the session closes and give us your feedback. Candidly, I'm not getting the numbers of responses I need to those evaluations. I know a lot of you come to a lot of sessions and you're probably like, it's cool, I don't have to respond, but it's really important to us and it's important to the presenter. So if you can make that commitment right now, there's only 4 questions. We really value your feedback and shape the program around it. So thanks for that commitment. So now what I want to do is ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. If you can share name and pronouns and your role and where you live and work. And if you thought about this question in advance or can do it on the fly, somebody that inspires your leadership. If you didn't think about it in advance, find a pass on that. Juliet, can I start with you?
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for inviting me, and thank you for your wisdom. She, ella, my name is Juliet de Jesus Alejandre from the Logan Square Neighborhood Association in Chicago. I spent the first 14 years at LSNA as Director of Youth Organizing, where we kind of created this model of organizing that included a lot of healing justice elements like ancestor work, movement, breathing, political and historical analysis with like gentrification and decriminalizing schools. And now I'm a year and a half into the ED role at my organization, which is on the northwest side of Chicago, that is quickly becoming unrecognizable to those of us who grew up in the city because of gentrification and displacement. That means there's a lot of dysphoria and hurt and anger around all the economic opportunities and resources that we see coming up, right, that we needed for years to make our community a safe and thriving place. And now we're seeing white folks to join it, right? And everything looks beautiful and new. And I'm angry that it causes a lot of my own people to increase their internalized racism when they're like, well, now everything's perfect, right? And we just couldn't get it together. And so a lot of our work is around decolonizing, right? Like the decolonial work, right? Of the narrative of who we are and how we got here. I'm proud to say that even with all of that, like Logan Square still has the highest concentration of Latinx homeowners in the city, despite housing costs going up by 5%. So who my leader is are folks like Cheryl Graves from Community Justice for Youth Institute, Dr. Rocio Rosales Missa from the Decolonial Alchemy, because they come from an organizing lineage that is highly spiritual and has a decolonial lens, with an end result in liberation that we never quite get to. And they're women who really think of the work of getting free politically requires deep belief in human connection, mutual aid, community care that comes from a deep place of love and care for ourselves and our spirits, as well as policy and organizing work. So that's a little bit about me, and good afternoon to all.
And how could I have made that mistake again in typing the name of your organization? So I apologize, and that will be corrected in the slides you get. Appreciate you. Kiera.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kiera Johnson, pronouns she and they. I'm currently the executive director of the National LGBTQ Task Force. This is my second go-round as an executive director. I was also the executive director, my first go-round, of Unite for Reproductive and Gender Equity, which is a sexual health and reproductive justice organization that works with young people. I also serve on two philanthropic boards, and they are the Groundswell Fund and the General Service Foundation. I live in Washington, D.C. I work from my home in Washington, D.C. We're a national organization. But I also have to say I'm from Georgia. I was born in Valdosta, Georgia. For any of those of you that don't know Georgia like that, it's way South Georgia. It matters. Closer to the Florida border than Atlanta, but I also lived in Atlanta as a kid as well. And that's just, no matter where I go, I'm just always from Georgia. It's just home. Inspirations. 50,000 foot level inspiration, Shirley Chisholm. And I will read two quotes that I read almost every day. One, you don't make progress by standing on the sidelines, whimpering and complaining. You make progress by implementing ideas. And the other, when asked like how she wanted people to remember her, how she wanted to be remembered in history, she said, not as the first Black woman to have made a bid for the presidency, but as a Black woman who lived in the 20th century and who dared to be herself. Right? Like that is audacious, and that is resistance, and that is in and of itself is a catalyst for change. And it inspires me every day, and I'm inspired by others who I see walking in that light, right? You know, watching the confirmations from Ketanji Brown Jackson, for example. I get inspired by others that I see reflecting that. And I think those were the questions. I think I'm done. Hey.
I think I'm up. Liz Sack from the Cricket Island Foundation, live and work in New York. I'm sitting in Brooklyn, New York. Pronouns are she, her, and I'm the executive director of the foundation. I'm going to be honest, I didn't even know we had a Twitter handle until I looked up under my profile picture. But anyway, someone that inspires my leadership. I mean, you know, I was thinking a lot about it, and then I realized, you know, obviously I'm a white woman in a privileged role, and there's not a lot in philanthropy that's real risk. Like there's not a lot that people in philanthropy do that actually creates risk. But when I speak to Juliet and Kiara, this is Kiara and I, second time doing a session together, and other leaders who are actually needing to deal with systems that are working against them and that are working in ways that hold them back, and actually have to be brave in real ways. That is my inspiration. That is my that is what humbles me, and that is what grounds me and reminds me of the work that that we have to do, and the ways that I need to use the privilege that I have to create some change. And thank you for putting this together, Jean, and excited for the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks all of you for being here. And Anya, if we could run the poll now, I'd love to, while we can't introduce everybody on the call, at least hear what roles you play. And this is a multiple choice. So any roles that you currently hold that are on this list: executive director, a staff who's not an executive director, a board member, a funder, a consultant, or something else. And of course, you might be two or even more of those things. So we'll give you a second to think of it. All right, Anya, if you can end that and share the results. All right, so everyone can see that. We've got a really good mix of folks, executive staff, non-executive staff, board, funders, and of course, many people are probably a couple of things. But thank you all for being here. It gives you a sense of who's in the room. As I said, the four of us have talked multiple times, and mostly I've been listening and trying to gather a certain direction or arc for this conversation. And this is the arc that we've landed on. I'm going to spend just a few minutes grounding in what we even mean by executive transition in 2022 and connecting that to, I think, probably our shared understanding of white supremacy norms, but just to ground in this space, to have a slide on that. So we're making the connection between why we think there's, or about why we think there's a reimagination that needs to happen and is underway in some corners. So we're going to talk a little bit about that just to ground ourselves, then turn it over to Kiara and Juliet to really talk about the selection processes for the jobs that they are now in and their decision to take the job. We're going to turn to Liz to hear a little bit about the pattern she's seeing and why she and other philanthropists have created an initiative called the Leading Forward Initiative that speaks to this culture shift and reimagination. Then we're going to drill in specifically to the board. We appreciate our boards and we appreciate all of you who are on boards, including our panelists. And this is a locus of some of the reimagination in our view. So we're going to talk very candidly about that. We're going to hear some more about what the experience has been so far of the executives on the call, and particularly also around self-care and support. And then we're each going to share, or they're each going to share some takeaways around this reimagination and disruption that we're talking about. So that just gives you a sense of the overall arc, even though it's going to be conversational, that's what to expect. So a little bit of grounding, and I'm just going to go ahead and do this for us so our speakers can get centered and ready to share their stories and perspectives. I think the first thing that we realize is that the actual selection of the CEO or executive director, like so many things, is the middle of the process. It's not the end, right? And that when we're thinking about executive transition, we are including in this conversation things that are upstream from that, including how executive leadership is assumed to be defined and structured in very tangible ways. We're seeing a lot more co-executive leadership. We're seeing people be much more open about strengths-based leadership and what is and isn't in their role. So just what do we even mean by executive leadership? Who is a leader? How do we search for our next leaders? So those questions precede the actual selection. They're kind of our mental models about executive leadership, right? Especially as we center BIPOC leaders, leaders who have lived experience of the movements they're about to run, et cetera. So those are pre-selection. There's the actual process of selection. Who picks the next leaders of our organization? And then after they're selected, what are the mindsets and support that leaders actually value from within their organization, from their boards, from community and colleagues? Liz is here to help us think about how have funders traditionally invested in this versus how might they think about investing in it now? And if you're a consultant or a coach, how are you advising outgoing leaders, boards, and incoming leaders to support this process? So we want to think broadly, is the bottom line there, about all of these aspects, because it all sort of fits together with how we're thinking of who's a leader, how to find them, how to support them in thriving. Like a lot of us, I think we are turning today to Tima Okun's definitions of white supremacy and white dominant norms. There are certainly many definitions out there, but this is one that I think really serves us for this conversation. I'll just read it. The explicit to subtle ways that the norms, preferences, and fears of white European descended people overwhelmingly shape how we organize our work in institutions, see ourselves and others, interact with one another and with time, and make decisions. So there's a ton in there, and there are whole webinars about that. But just to kind of ground us in, the impetus of this conversation is the intersection of the previous slide, all that goes into defining, selecting, and supporting executives today, and this white dominant norm that we're all working in terms of philanthropy, nonprofit sector, governance, search, all of these pieces. And I lastly want to lift up the work of our editor-in-chief, Cindy Suarez, who can't be here today, but who's done some recent writing about pro-Black. And there's a whole set of writings on the NPQ website about this right now. But I want to bring that perspective in too, that this is moving fast, as it should be. Our understanding of what our mental model even is, what our objectives are in transferring leadership. And the quote that I'm pulling here from her work on pro-Black organizations is, we're moving beyond DEI, bodies at the table, racial equity, measuring POC against white people, and perhaps even racial justice, the rightings of racial wrongs, to an actual focus on what Black people need to thrive. And again, this would, of course, help all of us thrive, as we know. And so just moving this mental model beyond what are the demographics of our next leader to actually what are the needs of our next leaders to thrive. So I want to bring all of that into the space today as a grounding. That's a very quick ride through that, but I hope that helps us situate this conversation where we intended it to be situated. So I want to turn it over to our leaders who are fairly recently in their roles. And I know that, Kira, this is your second go at this, right? And we're going to start with you. And I've got the questions that we're asking you to kind of start this storytelling off with on the slide here. They're also in your run of show, but want to turn it to you to really focus in on your experience, given all that grounding, of the selection process and what you were coming into and how you decided to take this job.
Sure, thank you so much. Would I describe the organization as historically white-led? The short answer is yes, and it's complex. Not all of the leaders, particularly the executive directors of the organization, have been white folk, and the majority of them have been. And in the last 25 years, I think there's been one other person of color, and combined, we have served 2 years of the last 25. So while, representation matters. And I think it's something to be really, to name and acknowledge that a 50-year-old organization has had multiple leaders, right, who identified racially, ethnically as something other than white. We also have to talk about culture, right? The culture of an organization, right? The systemic and institutional, right? Ways of being that become woven into an organization. And in that way, I would say, yes, it is a historically mainstream white-led organization. And, that's, I know we'll get into more details about that, but it has presented all sorts of challenges, in terms of what that means and when and where I enter and other people of color enter in their leadership, not just at the executive level either, right? But at various leadership levels throughout the organization. What is the expectation? What is tradition, right? How is success being measured and not? What is being considered and not? What is being valued and not? We did not, in both transitions, my first transition at URGE into URGE executive director or at the task force, we didn't use a search firm. I was an internal candidate, an internal hire, and there were well over a year's worth of conversations that were had with the board and with the executive director at the time about what me coming into leadership might look like. I think one of the things that it has been one of the things that has been consistent, and this is both, I have found this as both someone coming in as executive director, but also being on a board of of organizations that have been through executive transitions, is that there's been so much focus on getting the right candidate and what do they need to have and what don't we want, and how have they had to show up, and what successes, do they need to have under their belt, and who do they need to know. And there's little to no time focused on who do we need to be as a board, right? How are we going to show up? Where are we lacking? What books do we need to read? How are we going to hold ourselves accountable? What does support look like? Do we have the capacity to even give it? Right. And so I think that those are places, that require a shift. And again, I know we'll get into more of those later. But the yes, how did I get to the yes? OMG, y'all. Like, it was like, the real question is, why did I say yes again? Because I was an executive director. I left really okay not being executive director. I was running away from being an executive director. Let's be clear. People were like, are you going to feel weird about like not being the boss? I was like, no, I'm so excited to not be the boss. I didn't know what I was burnt out on. Am I burnt out on the organization that I'm at? Am I burnt out on the movement that I'm in? Am I burnt out on nonprofit like structure, like infrastructure movement in this way? I didn't know. And so coming into the task force, I came in a leadership position as the deputy, and I said yes to that because I believed in the executive director. So my predecessor, Ray Carey, after being an executive director, I knew what I wanted from an executive director, right? Like, I knew I wanted to support someone's vision and leadership that I believed in. I wanted someone who I knew would trust me and my leadership, right? I wanted someone who I could also continue to learn from. And then the yes for executive directorship, and both times, it was a lot of conversations. It's being asked directly. I've said this before, my own Jane, if you can give me the X if I'm talking too long. My own imposter syndrome is something that I grapple with. Like, I mean, maybe somebody finally crosses that threshold and they're like, what? I'm the shit, right? Like, I don't know, but I constantly battle with that. And the first time around, even more so. But being in a space with executive, my current EDs were really supportive, right? And it's not that I needed them to be like, you're great. Like, I needed to be able to be honest and real about what I was worried about and what my fears were, and for them to talk in real plain talk about where the board was, where the pitfalls they thought were. I had an explicit conversation with Ray before I said yes, because I was like, I don't know, I'm not you, right? Like, I'm not an honorary gay white boy, right? They're not going to receive me in the same way, right? Like, I have 3 kids, 4, 11, and 14, right? Like, elementary, middle, and high school. I can't live, drink, breathe the organization and be on call in the same way, right? And emphatically, she was like, no, you're not me, and you're who we need now, right? Like, you don't have to be me or to aspire to be me or train up to be me. Like, and it was helpful to be in a real dialogue and conversation with her about that, and to know, right? Like, I could have the conversation with her, the chairs of the board at that time, and also some key leadership team members at the time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. So much to follow up on, and we will keep following up on it. Thanks. Juliet.
Ooh, imposter. Maybe there's a pill for imposter syndrome that we could take or we could create out of these series. I don't know. That would be great. So again, so LSNA, Logan Square Neighborhood Association, is a community-based organization, right? And we turned 60 years old this year. So another, right, long-term or long-time organization. And we're gonna change the name, by the way. So it's okay that you got it wrong on the side because it's gonna be different anyway. Don't worry. So it was began by white homeowners who wanted to protect their property values, right? During the urban renewal, all the urban renewal policies and decisions that were being made, right? In the 60s, and a lot of white folks were flying off to the suburbs. So that is our history, right? And Logan Square slowly through that process became a majority Latinx neighborhood in the 1980s when I was growing up. Back then, mostly Caribbean immigrants and migrants, like my father's family, and now a mixture from all over Latin America. And so we right now are changing our name to Palenque LSNA, you all are hearing that, to better reflect who we've been really since the 1990s at the organization, when brown and Black and immigrant mothers became the base of our organizing through our schools. And yet we proceeded to have leadership that was white and not even from Chicago, right? Which is wild to me as a community-based organization. You know, and Nancy, who was the ED before me for 30 some years, who I love and is my mentor and a friend in so many ways, she announced her retirement to lead staff, right? To lead organizers about 2 years in advance. And our staff was pretty clear that if the next leader wasn't from the neighborhood, wasn't from amongst us, then a lot of us felt like we had to walk away. And Nancy, thankfully, her intention was the same, right? She was nervous though about the board. She didn't really know how the board was what direction they were gonna go. But when the staff, right, we're organizers, we talked to each other, we got organized. And when we were clear on what we wanted to say to the board, I am so grateful that they listened. Because we are a community-based organization who does leadership development. And if you can't find a leader amongst us, then there's a problem, right? And they took that seriously, thankfully. And then it was the question of who. We're all looking at each other, right? Like, who is it gonna be? I'm an Aries, it's my season. So naturally I want to lead everything. Like I was taking Zumba classes and I had to get certified because I was like, I need to choose the playlist. Like, what's going on here? So that's how impulsive I am, right? But also I was torn. I was torn because I'm a mom. Thank you, Kara, right? I'm a mom of three boys. Two of which have, complex disabilities, right? And I'm also the resource coordinator and coach and all of those things that come with it. And I didn't know if I could take on this role, right? And be who I needed to be in my life. And God forbid also do something completely else, like write or paint or whatever else, right? That I want to do and not just completely lose myself to this role. And I know that a lot of my friends and my mentors have sacrificed a lot of their own lives, right, to be leaders. So when the pool of who is it going to be got smaller and smaller, and I kept feeling inside of me that it was me, what landed me on yes was that my colleagues came around and said, like, how are we going to make this possible for you? Like, we want you to do it. So how are we going to have your back? And we sat down, right? And like literally created charts around the different parts of the role and which areas, right? Could they be kind of like my right-hand people on, right? So if it was finance or if it was, God, things like the building, right? Like things that you don't even think about, like as an ED, right? Like as an organizer, I'm like, oh my, I have to think about the building? Really? Like that kind of stuff, right? And so having people right around me who are like, no, I got you on that, right? Or I'll do this with you was amazing. I asked them to commit for a year. I was like, y'all can't leave, you cannot quit. Like, I don't want to be an ED. I want to be the ED with you all, right? Like you are it. I'm not trying to, right? Like it's not a career move for me. It's because I love the work that we're doing. And if you leave, then we're not doing that work and then I don't want to do it. And it was their commitment. to my leadership, to being there for me, that helped me to say yes. And yeah, still learning, still growing, still trying to push up against the expectations of this job that I think are oppressive for anybody who's doing it, right? And mostly fighting myself, right? And trying to get grounded every day. We'll talk more about the stuff that Kira and I have shared and that we do to get grounded every day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And just that, I thought it was really important to lift up the decision-making process. I think we spend so much time thinking about selection and not enough about what candidates go through in deciding whether they even want to take this on. And I love your phrasing of, how do I not lose myself in this job? And Kiara, you too, about saying, you know, some of the archetypes of this job are 24/7. Right? Like this is their, it seems as if it's their whole life, right? And you don't feel parenting and you don't feel the need for support from other staff, et cetera. So just really appreciate you giving insight into that. Liz, I want to bring you into this conversation from the philanthropic perspective and from that 30,000-foot view that you have as a funder of executive transitions and of community-based organizations. And just ask you to talk a little bit about why you felt at this point that there was a need for an initiative around executive transitions.
Sure. Somebody wrote in the Q&A that the risk in philanthropy was complacency, which I completely agree with. I think the challenge is that within philanthropy, people see the risk as, I actually don't know what it is when people say risk, but they see it as something related to their grant, picking the wrong grantees or something along those lines. And part of that is that when we first started talking to folks about transitions, we heard from a lot of groups that funders took what is called a wait and see approach. They said, we're going to stop funding you. And actually, I can remember when I started thinking about this more, I had a grantee in Brooklyn, and she was amazing, was a founder, and was ready to leave. Woman of color, was terrified of telling any of her funders, and we spent a lot of time talking about how she could tell her funders, because the practice was that they would hold their funding, and she had a couple of large grants that were pending at the exact moment that she was sort of feeling like, I'm burnt out and I'm ready to leave. She ended up having to take her process of leaving took a lot longer because funders said, if you leave, anytime within X period of time, we're not going to be funding you anymore. So it started really from those kinds of conversations. And in the past couple of years, there's been what people in philanthropy calling the Great Resignation. There's a huge amount of turnover in the nonprofit sector. And it's happening at the same time that the sector is not necessarily knowing how to support leaders, how to support transition, how to support organizations. When you ask funders, we did a session a while ago for funders about leadership transitions and asked people to put in the chat what comes to mind when they hear transition. And there was a lot of fear-based things. And why, it doesn't make a ton of sense. I'm not quite sure where the fear is for the funders. So, there was these two things that are meeting up, which is there's a lot of transition. Funders aren't necessarily sure what to do with it, and they tend to, as I said, to either put the brakes on or pause or whatever it might be. At the same time, funders that are coming in, there's more and more leaders of color coming in, leaders that are coming from impacted communities, emerging leaders, folks who are stepping into leadership for the first time, and we have a lot of research and tools that think about leadership from a very traditional standpoint. So it used to be we responded with people should take financial management classes and go get mentor about how to be a better supervisor or those kinds of things. But it's not that easy. Folks are looking for more holistic support, and more importantly, we shouldn't be making the decision. I mean, we're funders. What do we know about what individual people need? And the last thing I'll say is that funders tend to think about transition as the moment when somebody leaves. So there might be a willingness and an openness to support a consultant to come in and do work with a board on a transition plan, or put up a transition plan, or a hiring, whatever. And then we leave new leaders just dangling out there. Good luck. You know, we hope it works out, and freak out if there's a bump in funding or there's any tension with the staff, which of course there is going to be. It is completely normal. So it all came from a place of recognizing that that we in philanthropy have money, which we should be using better, and that we need to, at this particular moment, when there is so much transition, when there are so many leaders stepping up, coming from within their communities, like Juliet, who are saying, I want to do this, we need to do better. We need to do a better job of enabling those leaders to be successful. We need to do a better job of letting them define success and letting go of the things that we think mean success. We need to give them the same patience that we give to white leaders when they leave. I mean, it's, you know, it's funny because in philanthropy, somebody will leave and then you'll find out they went and got a fellowship or whatever the case may be, or people will say, a leader who recently went into philanthropy say, it's great, I have a whole board behind me and they're giving me all this money to go and take trainings, and none of that happens for their I know this organization's grant, it wasn't happening for the grantees. So there are practices that we embrace for ourselves. There are practices that the private sector embraces within transition that we just do not allow the space and breathing room and patience for our grantees to go through the same, with the same amount of support and patience and belief. So for me, it really started from that place and wanting, and the recognition, I think, for me, that we, the Cricket Island Foundation, we can't fix this alone, because the woman that I originally was talking about, you know, I was encouraging her to tell other funders that she was transitioning, and it was terrible for her because she ended up losing funding because I was asking her to tell people. So if I'm asking my grantees to take a risk, I can't throw them to the lion's den when I know what's going to be happening out in philanthropy. So the Leading Forward initiative, which is sort of more broadly thinking about how to change the philanthropy's approach to this, is really about trying to get other funders to recognize and change behaviors, because it can't happen from one funder. If I'm giving, you know, we give our grantees, you know, 3-year grants, lots of extra funding, all of these things to help them with their transition. But if we're the only funder doing that, it's not going to matter. So it has to be a broader, you know, sector-wide change.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate you. I know you can't represent all of philanthropy, but as we've talked about a lot, even in preparing for this, the ecosystem forces are so strong. We can do our own work and we can try to change our organizations, but if the external environment is still behaving in a certain way or expecting a certain thing, we're pushing uphill. There's more than we can go into here, but I thought if you could lift up, these are the 5 principles on the right that the Leading Forward initiative has identified for itself. And maybe you could just speak briefly to 1 and 3, because I think maybe those are the ones that stand out as of the moment. What do you mean by those 2?
I mean, 1 is really about listening to leaders and letting them define what they need and giving, you know, I'm not going to give you an answer of what they need because it's not for me to decide, but it's the recognition that we need to listen to leaders and give them what they need and trust their leadership and trust their capacity, and give them the same support, belief, whatever that we would to white leadership and to folks in other sectors. And I think we're saying that here because I think we're wanting funders to say that's an intentional that it's an intentional commitment. Like when we make our funding decisions, we add points for a group. We don't use points. I don't want people to freak out that we have some chart going on, but we don't use points. But when we look for groups that have leaders from the community, we think that's a good thing. We think that makes an organization better and stronger. So it is both a practice around how we're supporting leaders and a value in terms of saying your leaders of the organizations that you're supporting should come from the communities in which they're working. I mean, who knows better than the communities, than folks that are coming from those communities. So I think that's sort of what we mean by number 1. And number 3, you know, when Juliet was talking about her own transition and, you know, sort of that moment of everyone looking around like they wanted someone from the community, there is a huge underinvestment in leadership pipelines. You know, the funders get, you know, we're focused on the leader. And there's now, there's been a lot more movement in philanthropy to fund leaders. There's beginning to be people talking about the need to fund pipelines, but there's a huge underinvestment in it. So what happens? Well, an organization has an opening, and in the private sector, people move around between companies. You know, you sort of, you get to where you can go in the organization that you're working with, and you want the next challenge. Now, for Juliet, it happened in her organization that there was someplace for her to go. And if there wasn't, hopefully, Juliet, you would have gone somewhere else. But the people that are underneath the leader need to be getting an investment in their own leadership and development, so that when those opportunities come up in other places, they can get there. And you didn't ask about it, but I'm just going to say it relates also to number 2, in that if we're not accepting transition as healthy, as normal, as good, as an opportunity to reflect, to change, to grow, then we're not giving people anywhere to go. I mean, we fund youth organizing groups, and we've had groups where the leader, the young person leading it, is 42 years old or something. I mean, it's time. They need to move on. They're not a young person anymore. And that's not bad. That's okay. But when we don't say that out loud, when we don't say it's a good thing for folks to leave, then there's no place for people to go. People get further and further away from the work. And it doesn't enable folks, you know, the investment in the pipeline only works if people have someplace to go. And I'll say it's the same thing in philanthropy. In all areas of work, transitions are good. Transitions are healthy. We need to talk about them. We need to let people not, you know, I was looking in the chat and people were, you said, what do people think about when they hear transition? It was like fraught, arg, you know, uncertainty. It is all those things. And because it means change is happening and change is scary, but it shouldn't be all those things because you're afraid your funders are going to leave or whatever, right? That shouldn't be an added burden of what transitions are. So you know, the 5 principles that we did, and I want to just step back and say, with the name Leading Forward and the principles, we had a group of leaders who had recently transitioned out of their organizations who actually came up with this stuff, because our feeling was whatever we were doing needed to be coming from leaders who were telling us, what is it that you need? What do you need philanthropy to do? And what do you need us to do? And so all of the stuff that you're seeing from Leading Forward came from the leaders in the field, because again, it doesn't make sense for me as a white woman in philanthropy to be defining what has to happen to make change easier and better for leaders and for organizations.
Appreciate that a lot, and the background. And I hope that you and others are successful in changing the culture around executive transition. I've been working in and around executive transition for over 20 years. I was at Compass Point for 18 years in the Bay Area. And it's interesting to me that we're here again, and that a whole discipline was created and really did not have certainly transitions are healthy was part of it, but these other pieces were not there, right? And certainly the changing understanding of leadership and who leads and how they lead was not there. And so we're in, I think, a rebirth of this, quote, discipline and set of practices, and many of them have to be challenged and reimagined, thus this conversation. And with that segue, I want to go right into the conversation about boards of directors and our assumptions and realities about boards as sort of the sole choosers of executive directors. And Liz, I'm going to stay with you for a second and then turn it back over to the leaders, because I just want to ask you, from your position of relative privilege, a very pointed question, which is this: is the unquestioned centrality of boards and boards alone in choosing the next CEO part of our problem?
I would say yes. I mean, I would say if that centrality is defined by philanthropy or folks outside the organization, 1,000%. If an organization has you know, folks from the community, or you know, a board that is really connected to the work, then the answer might be no. But I think that the roles need to be defined by the community in which the organization is working. And I think in philanthropy, we look to boards as expert, which is a very sort of old school white supremacist approach to who is expert and who has answers. And oftentimes boards are the furthest away from the work. And I just want to take 1 second to say, somebody had asked there were a couple of questions in the Q&A about, different structures and calling out leadership and all of those things. I want to those are things for Chiara and Juliet to answer, but I do want to say, I think that's part of philanthropy needing to get out of the way and let organizations, and sometimes boards getting out of the way, to let an organization decide we want to do a co-leadership, we want to do whatever the case may be. But as it relates to boards, again, I think yes, if that's not an internal decision, but an external decision that came from a funder or somebody else.
And is it fair to say that even in the very recent past, even in this operating context where people are saying that they want to center and support BIPOC leaders, that you've seen boards make some really bad decisions behaviorally?
Yes, I mean, we are, I'm obviously not going to name names, and my partner in crime, Lori Bazala from the Hazen Foundation, is on, and she'll recognize this story, but there's actually a group that we're working with. She and I both fund, and the group just went through a transition, and the board is essentially coming forward and making some choices around programming and vision without the input of the staff and the community. And there are cases like that. I think the issue around transitions is that we often give the boards the power, and then we'll say, are you getting input from X, Y, or Z community? But we don't, what does that input mean if there's not agreement? Who holds, is there really shared power, or are you just saying we're collecting input, but we win, board trumps if we don't like the candidate that the staff picked. So I think for us, one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is, how do we give organizations the support to create a process that's truly inclusive, where it's a board, whatever the hiring committee is, should be whatever the organization defines that it needs it to be. But that was a long answer of saying, yes, we've seen it happen many, many times where it's just not good.
Yeah. And I'm going to take this opportunity to just, in case there's anybody on the call who's like, well, but that's the law, the board has to choose, to drive you to very trusted sources like Board Source, probably among the most trusted governance sources, the national organization Board Source on the left, Nonprofit Law Blog on the right. There is absolutely no reason that only board members should be on the search committee, right? So just I think a lot of times we start to use terms like board roles and responsibilities as if they're laws. And they're not laws. Boards have great latitude to create the committees and task forces that would be most relevant to the work at hand. So I'm sure most people on the call know that, but I just want to put that out there and make sure that we're all working from the same understanding that if a board, and I would argue an outgoing CEO can help a board realize that they do not have the expertise or the proximity to the work or where the work is going to be the sole selectors of the next CEO, that they recognize that and create the appropriate committee and task force to undertake that work. So just want to speak to that very directly and make sure that we're all working from that same assumption. And now we want to turn it back to hear what's happening with our leaders with respect to the board partnership and board readiness. Who is going to go first here? Let me find my, Juliet is going to go first. And so this is getting to the board partnership. And would you say in retrospect that they were ready, whatever that means? And how are you creating, if you are, new expectations together?
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, right? I think kind of going back a little bit to what Liz was saying earlier about all the different options that are available to support leaders, like even just hearing that menu, right, of like, there's fellowships, there's this, like, what? I'm like taking notes, right? Because I don't know that, right? I don't, and I think that's part of, often our funders will ask me, right, in a meeting and will say, well, like, how can I support you? And I'm like, give me a clue, like, where's the menu, right? Like, let me know, because there's like an assumption that I know kind of these resources, or coming from a community-based organization, right? Where we're like, I'm like running IT and like helping, remove the snow, right? Like I don't know all the resources that are available. So even just like listing that, like, this is what we've provided to other, right, incoming executive directors, Juliet, like, would this be helpful to you, right? Like, I think that just even hearing that out loud and not expecting me to know is really helpful. I think the other piece, particularly to my board, is that they had my back, and we, again, we're a community-based organization, so we select, we have a nominations committee, and we really think about who has connections in our work, right? Who has been a part of our displacement work? Who's been a part of our mutual aid work? Who's an important teacher who has been supporting our parent mentor program, right? And those are the folks that we invite in to be members of our board. So there is this kind of intimacy, right? Like, of understanding the community. However, to think that my board would know on a day-to-day or even on a cellular level what was important for my people, my staff, is again wild to me, right? Because we meet quarterly, and they're wonderful people, and I love them, and I text with them, right? But they don't know at that level. And so thinking of the board as the starting point or the pinnacle, right, like, has to be completely interrupted. Like, trust people running the organization every day, on the front lines every day, having walking alongside families who are facing eviction every day. Like, that's who knows, right? So one example, right, of an interaction that I had with a board member who, again, right, in a very healthy, I think, situation that I'm in, even so, we still internalize, right, and perpetuate white supremacy culture. All of us do, right? We're all in some kind of process of healing from that. But this board member said, we went with you even though you're a non-traditional leader. And I was too flustered by it all, right, at that moment to like be able to question it, right? Because I was just like, what does she mean? I don't know. I mean, I know I'm not, right, like, I'm not white, but at the same time, like, what do you really mean? Because I'm like, I got a master's degree, like, I played the fucking game. Like, what are you talking about, right? And in my community, right, me being a teen mother who, because of my family support, I was able to keep going to school, being a mother of 2 children with disabilities, like so many of our parent mentor leaders also have children with IEPs, being a co-parent and trying to navigate the world that way, being the daughter of a father impacted by the carceral state, and a granddaughter and a daughter of immigrants living with the effects of like post-traumatic disorder of this society, and yet still every day thriving and trying to make my and my family and my community's lives more brilliant and abundant, make me a very traditional leader, right, in my community. So like that comment, right, to me, just like, I don't even understand that, right? Like, how can I be non-traditional? What would be non-traditional was to have gone through a search firm, right, and flown out somebody from Iowa, or who was raised in a safe suburban environment, armed with a degree only in political science and a bunch of good intentions, right? To come and then organize my people. That's non-traditional. That doesn't make sense, right? What is important, I think, to say is that my mother, my grandmother, my aunts, the guy selling corn on the corner right now, waiting for the kids to come out of school, like, we've always been leaders, always, right? They're just in ways that dominant society doesn't recognize, right? Doesn't compute, right? But we've always been taking care of each other. We know how to organize ourselves. It's happening, y'all. So what I've told my white board members or potential partners and white staff members is to give me time and the space to feel my leadership, to believe in my own leadership, right? To experience it, right? Because it's different. It's so different. Even though I've been an organizer for so long, the job of an organizer is to stay behind the scenes. My job was mostly to prepare young people to do shit that I had never done before myself, right? Like, go talk to this congressman, go do this, go do that. You can do it. And I'm like, at the same time, I'm like, I've never done that, right? Like myself. And so as an ED, then all of a sudden now I'm in front, right? Which is so antithetical to how an organizer is prepared, right? Or trained. So give me time to feel this, right? Like to understand who I am publicly, to form my vision, to express it fully first, not to the board, right? Not even to my funders, but to express it fully to my people, right? To express it to those who've been impacted by the cruelty of the system first. This whole idea of palenque, you know, that there are these spaces that we're calling back to where ancestors in Latin America, Africans escaping slavery created these palenques, these safe spaces in Latin America, and just teaching about it, right, and bringing it up as just like history lesson during pandemic with my staff, mostly my Latinx staff and my Black staff, to talk about what we were going through, and then right away my white staff was like, well, how do I fit in, right? And I'm like, I can't do that right now because there's so much that we have to deal with even understanding Latinos as part of Blackness, right? That actually 85% of Africans who were kidnapped came to Latin America, y'all, right? Like that we are a huge part of the African diaspora, like all that work, like that need to be an internal conversation first before I figure out what this means for you, right? Funder or staff person. And to give me that space to articulate it, and for you to kind of sit with some of the discomfort for a minute, right, and figure out how you fit in as a support person, really, right? So that's some of the stuff that I've been dealing with the board. Were they ready? I think I want to say they were excited, but I think it's definitely been. They couldn't have been completely ready, right? Because they didn't know. It was 30, they had 32 years with Nancy, right? And so there is this kind of touch and go that we're doing, but I feel very supported, and I know that I'm lucky because I think of even some of my colleagues, Black and Brown women who haven't felt at all loved and supported by their boards and have spent so much energy fighting their boards about their vision for their own community, which is wild. And I think, I think such a waste of energy. What I appreciate most about my board is that what they have said is like, our job literally is to support you, to help you think about policy. The day-to-day, how you live that out, that's why we hired you. We trust you, right? And so I feel so grateful for those boundaries and that clarity that I have in my board. But I know I know that so many people are struggling, and it's a real problem.
Ooh, appreciate very much that answer. Thank you. Kira, do you want to share a little bit about thinking about board readiness and relationship at this stage?
Sure. I as you were talking, Juliet, this concept of ready or not ready is a false dichotomy, right? Like, and I think maybe that's part of the problem, right? Because there's so much pressure to be ready or to sound ready or to look like you're ready or say the right words, right? To signal you're ready. And readiness is a journey, right? Like, what ready is today was different than pre-pandemic, right? What was ready 3 years ago was different than ready 10 years before that, right? And so I think part of, again, like we talk about white supremacist culture, internalized racism or structural racism, institutional racism, this need to be right? This need to be defined, to have the answers, the equation needs to be solved, and then we follow it, and we've always followed it this way because it is right, and we will not steer away from this thing that we've decided is right and traditional. And I think that's where we get into trouble, right? I think readiness is about asking, being willing to grapple with the question of how ready are we? And what would it take to be more ready, right? What are the things we need to do in the next year? What are the things we need to do in the next 2 years? What did we learn from the last process that we want to incorporate as we go forward in our learning, right? To be more ready. I think one of the things that has been really challenging, and it's also just humanness, is that people project all of their hopes and fears onto our leadership, right? And it's less about us and more about whoever is in the process of valuing or evaluating, right? Whether or not we're the right fit, right? Whether we're being successful as leaders. And so, I mean, literally, and this happened, not just at the board space, but I think in the movement, as I was coming into leadership, there were people who were like, because of who I am and my identities and my experiences, there was a camp of, Kira's gonna come in here, she's gonna burn it down, and she's gonna, gonna be the phoenix from the flames. The task force is gonna be brand new on I don't know, month 11 of her leadership, right? And then there was this other camp, right, that was like, oh my God, she's gonna burn it down. I don't think I have a place here anymore. What about me? What about the 20 years that I've been a part of this organization, of its vision, of its centeredness, of its focus? There was another camp that was like, Kiara is too much like Ray. I don't see the difference. She's not enough like Ray. I don't hear it, Ray. I don't understand. Like, why, I'm worried she's going to change it up. So how it played out had nothing to do with me. Most of these folks, right, like had very few conversations or deep conversations about my vision or what I wanted or what my goals were or what I was grappling with, right? Like, and I think we've got to flip that, right, from an accountability place to a learning place, right? Like I'm in my best stance when with boards and as a board member when I am in a strategic thinking, right, space, like when we're strategic partners, when my board members are like, hey, what are you seeing that's different, right? What are you seeing that are the challenges? How's it going with your staff, right? Like, are there supports that you need there, right? Where can I be helpful, right? As opposed to, you need to, why aren't you? But really being in a curious mind, right, about how leadership shows up differently, right? And where and where the challenges may be differently. I think that, the board, my current board, was really open to asking the question, what do we need to be ready? There were board members who posed that question. And one of the things and they asked me like what I thought too. And the board hadn't had like a racial equity conversation in recent history. And I was really clear, like, I love y'all. It's clear you want me here, and that's not enough, right? Like that's a part of readiness, right? That's not ready, but it is a part of ready, right? So let's take the next step of getting ready, which is grappling with that we have internalized racism, internalized anti-Blackness, that most of the leadership in the LGBTQ movement is not femme, right? Female, women identified, right? And what does that mean, right? What does implicit bias look like for me as a board member, for us as a board institution? How are we going to check it, right? So that for me was the openness to ask that question and the willingness to like lean into that. And I'm not saying everybody was like, hell yeah, race equity, let's do it. Like, not everybody was there. There were some folks who were there, but everybody was willing to just at a base level be like, okay, let's give this a shot. Right. And so that for me is one of the indicators. Right. And the last thing I'll say about this, Juliet, you said in a session that we had when we were planning, and I wrote it down because I told you it landed on me so intensely. You said it almost makes me want to cry because that's how intensely it resonated with me. You said, I had to learn to listen closely to myself. And it is really easy for the noise of everybody else's fears, everybody else's expectations, everybody else's needs and wants, projections, assumptions about you, your identities, your leadership, to get in the way. And to, like, part of leadership, what I heard when you said that was, leadership is dampening that noise, right? And it's not about dismissing it, right? Like, that's data. But listening to yourself and trusting your own gut, trusting your own knowledge, trusting your own connections, trusting your own vision, trusting your own judgment, right? Like, in the noise of all of that is true leadership. And it takes a lot of energy to really get into that and to be able to, like, for that to be your default. I statements. For me, for that to be my default, right? For it to be a default, and it require less energy for me to default there.
Yeah, and again, I can, to me, this is the conversation about executive transition that isn't caught up in the steps of first you set the job description, then you select a search committee, then you get your funder to pay for it. I mean, this is what executive transition is about in a lot of ways. And part of, like, for me, a call to action is, how does anyone involved in executive transition, whether you're a staff member supporting someone who's willing to step up to it, like in your both of your stories, or you're a board member or you're a funder, how do you remember that this is all part of it, right? The day you choose the ED is not, that's not it. The job's not over, right? Like, how do we understand what it really feels like to be in this role? Just being mindful of time, I want to ask you, and you've addressed some of these pieces, each of you in your own ways. So let's do kind of a choose your own adventure here. And invite you to definitely, I think we all want to hear about what is self-care and what support has actually been valuable. We heard you, Juliet, on, I'm not even sure I knew the menu of support, so that's one thing. And anything that hasn't been valuable, right? As if we think about executive transition as including supporting leaders in thriving and getting grounded in their vision, invite you to talk about any of these things, but certainly the things below the yellow line. Juliet, do you want to kick off?
Yeah. So the approaching the self, and Kira and I kind of went in pretty deeply in what we do every day to kind of build ourselves up. Yes, babe. Sorry, that's my baby in the background. When I think about, at LSNA a lot, I hear mama and youth leaders in the meetings, whether they're strategy meetings or just a regular check-in, there's so much love that people are pouring into each other. They start meetings with affirmations or with breath. There's this constant need to kind of, I recognize that everybody's carrying so much hurt. We're gonna spend some time, right, like loving ourselves for a minute, as they're dealing with displacement and disinvestment, school budget cuts, policing, deportations, right? And so we integrate a lot of healing practices in our work, and I model that too, right? And so kind of, I go to therapy. The day that I got actually the news that the board voted me in, I was with my therapist and I picked it up. I was like, I'm in therapy right now. What's the news? And then older people on our board were like, oh my God, she said she was in therapy. And I'm like, I didn't even understand like why that was a big deal. I'm like, you should be grateful I'm in therapy. Like I'm getting my shit together. But so that's one. But that centering what Kara was saying, right? That every day getting quiet in the morning before my kids wake up, of meditating, dancing, going for a walk, whatever it is that I need to do to get into my heart, to know what the anxiety, that heaviness is there. Like, can I tap into that? What is that about? What am I learning? What are the lessons? What is my voice saying? And I'm a nerd, right? I'm constantly reading. I'm constantly listening to podcasts, right? Of people who are doing healing justice work, who are doing organizing work, who are thinking about things in an international way or in a very long arc, kind of historical way. Like that stuff feeds my spirit, right? And I bring it to my staff. I think the piece about what's helpful or what's not helpful, and this connects back to the imposter syndrome, is that I don't want to have to be perfect, but that's definitely the weight that I carry, right? As much as I say, right, like I want to be unapologetically myself, like I carry that weight, because if LSNA, if Logan Square Neighborhood Association starts, right, like not getting funding or like isn't as powerful and moving citywide policy over, it's going to be because, right, the way the narrative would be is because it's me, right? Because now that we don't have a white leader, Juliet, whatever, she dropped the ball and shit's all messed up, right? Like, I mean, that's the narrative, right? That's the narrative, right? And so that weight is real every day in every meeting that I go to, right? I am conscious of that. And so there is this need every day to reject it and to affirm myself. And even this morning, my new thing is like, I want to adore myself. So this yellow dress today was about me, like practicing adoring myself, right? Because I have to consciously, intentionally do it. Because otherwise, right, the other noise is like, you're not leading, like, I don't recognize, right? Like, you're not yelling at people at meetings, right? Because that's what people think of organized. You're not doing this, you're not doing that. And I'm like, well, because that isn't my fucking style, right? Because I want to do this work and live and not die of a heart attack, right? I want us to build relationships. I want us to understand how we get there together. I have a different way of leading. I did not think that, and don't mistake that for weakness, right? Me wanting to work with other people is not weakness. It's practical. We're in this together, right? So how are we going to do that? And how do we still speak our truth? Let me think about the other piece. And I think that what has been affirming, you know, as I was envisioning, and it was very, and I was, you know, one of our funders, Hazen, it was very astute of Isabel. Sorry, just calling out. I know we're not supposed to be calling out people, but as we were playing at Ellison with this idea of palenque, like Ellison, that we're building this palenque in our community. What does that mean? It's like part sanctuary where we're like taking care of each other and feeding people, mutual aid work, right? When we're thinking the beginning of the pandemic, and also like, and it's policy work, right? Like racial healing is policy, just that we feel good. And that's really important. I'm not gonna, that's really important. And also that we're creating something different, right? And sustaining that. And it was, and us just beginning to explain that we're, you know, in a meeting, support meeting that Hazen had called together for grantees during the pandemic, right? The early part of the pandemic, when we're all trying to figure out what we're supposed to be doing, where she's like, that's something right there. Like, can we pay for kind of just consulting on marketing and branding? Like, again, I don't know what's on the menu. I didn't know that was a thing, right? We never worked with consultants before. And so that validating experience of a funder saying like, did you know you could do this? Did you know that there are people who can help you with this? And we're gonna actually help pay, in addition to what we've already given to you, we're gonna help you pay for this, right? So those are some of the concrete ways that my leadership was supported by funders in this, yeah. So I'm happy to hear what Kiro, how have you been supported? Or what have
Thank you?
Yeah.
Yes, all the things, therapy, coaches, flowers and candles in the background. Slack channels that only allow for feel-good pictures and gifs. Um, I a lot of work around mindfulness, right? And approaching courageous conversations, right? One of the things I feel that I've learned along the way is that I have to lean in to the conversations that I'm most afraid of. And that's, yes, it's about the work, yes, it's about the organization, but it's actually about my self-preservation, because I found myself eating, like the anxiety and the dread and the fear and the right was eating me up on the inside. But I had to learn, right, how to engage in challenging or hard conversations. Like how do we invest, right? Like that is often not the training, right, people want to offer you. They're like, fundraising training, communications training, finance training. Great, can you help me figure out how to tell my board chair that she needs to step up and wrangle the rest of the board, and it's not me, it's not my job to do that, it's her job to do that, right? How do I have a conversation, with my executive staff about how holding people accountable in and of itself is not white supremacy, right? Like we want to win, right? So let's have a hard conversation about what winning looks like, how we define it, and how we hold each other along the way, right? How we're supporting each other with benchmarks and training and support along the way, right? Like I remember having this conversation with a board member and a funder once too. Like there were just so many like training opportunities. It was like, and do you want to be a part of this leadership cohort and this training and this group and this and this and this? And I'm like, I am one person, and at some point I have to work. But then I would say my deputy director, or how about my field director? And it was like, no, 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 no. This is only for executive directors, presidents, and CEOs. Literally not helpful. I want to be surrounded by a staff of badasses. The only way that happens is if we are investing in and supporting the ecosystem, right, of which we're working in. I literally just had a coach come in to help start, like, to work with my leadership team, my executive team, because I came into the executive directorship under COVID. We have a brand new DED that came in under COVID. None of us have been in a room together, right, like in years. We need to pay attention and invest in what it means to be a team. We have to invest in that. It doesn't just organically happen, right? How do we come together in alignment and strategic thinking and be able to work through the ouch moments that happen, that were already difficult to work through when we were in person, but even more so when all we get is a screen in front of us, right, every day? It matters. I mean, it's already helped, and she's literally only talked to us one-on-one. We haven't even had a group session yet. I think it's important to be aware of the questions that we ask. And I've said this in a session with Liz before. One of the most frustrating questions I got from board members, from funders, was, what's your vision? That sounds so not harmful, right? Except this was February 2021. We had laid off 20% of our staff at the beginning of COVID. The ED who had been with us for over 13 years was leaving. We were virtual. I was like, I don't know, survival? I don't know. Like, keeping whole, being whole, reminding each other of our humanity, convincing people that productivity cannot look like what it did pre-pandemic. So we got to figure out what it is, right? Redefine it, hold ourselves to a different standard. but folks wanted lofty, big things. They were like, what's your big, audacious, hairy goal? I'm like, seriously, y'all, I can't. It's like, please stop it. It was not intentionally, I know, right? It's not intentionally harmful, and it's anxiety producing, because you're like, okay, watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat. I'm going to double the organization in 12 months under the pandemic. Awesome. I'm going to start this brand new program with a whole bunch of leaders that I've never met. Awesome. I'm going to totally do that. Yeah. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not doing that.
Well, and I mean, if I may, it's not intentionally harmful, but it's a perfect example of the kind of seemingly benign language that actually is really tone deaf to what leadership requires right now, and what we even mean by having a conversation about direction or quote unquote expectations. So super helpful. I want to, because we do want to end on time, I want to make sure that we have time for this last question around your recommendations or perspectives on, and you've obviously alluded to them, but in a way to summarize for people what you might offer up as ways of interrupting white supremacy norms through executive transition as broadly as we've defined it in this conversation. Liz, let me start with you and give Kiara and Juliet the last word. From your perspective and philanthropy, what would you summarize briefly in a minute or two about how philanthropy can show up differently to disrupt white supremacy norms in transition?
Give up power. Stop thinking we have the answers. We do not, and give up power. I mean, let organizations decide what it needs to look like and what it is, and give them, philanthropy, we like to overcomplicate and have strategic whatever. Our job is to give people money to help them be able to do their work. So give people money and let them do their work and get out of their way and stop and really reflect on the harmful practices, like Kiara said. There's these little things that we do that actually are incredibly harmful to organizations and don't let human beings deal with what they're having to deal with, right? We do things like ask people to come. We don't make it mandatory. We'll say we're having a gathering. You don't have to come. Well, it's a funder. There's a power dynamic. People feel like they have to come. Don't ask. Just don't ask. They don't need to come. That's for you. It's not for them. They're getting their support from somebody else. So be humble, get out of the way. And I think the last thing is just to really normalize the transition is okay. Make it part of your relationship with organizations. Fund in the beginning, fund the middle, fund the end, fund the new leader to do whatever they want to do, give them some breathing room, and let the organizations be who they are, and let go of whatever our ideas are about what the right answer has to be, whether it's co-directorship or a triad or whatever it is. None of these things are our decision. And that's really what it comes down to. So embrace that with some humility and sort of let organizations thrive and get out of the way.
I'll go, and I agree, and I think we've got to move out of being so prescriptive. People want to say, you have to have an interim executive director. Don't have an interim executive director. You have to have 3 months. No, you should have no less than a year of transition time and overlap. You have to have a search firm. No, do not have a search firm. You should do it in co-directors. Absolutely not co-directors. Stop it. It's not. Be in a curious place and create in collaboration what is needed for the time. You literally may need completely different interventions and processes for the same organization 10 years apart, right? It's just real. So being responsive and being in collaboration, right, with the staff and the community, the new executive director, the previous or the outgoing executive director, pre-post, and for a beyond a 3-month transition time, right? I fundamentally believe that an executive transition is no less than 2 years, right? Because for me, I'm the first year is I am just trying to figure out what other people's expectations are. The second is me figuring out what I want to be and what I don't, right? What I'm going to absorb and what I'm going to leave. And then I feel like I'm hitting the ground running. And that's just me, right? So transition also isn't static in terms of time frame. And I think we've got to pull the lens back to think about what does it take to create a sustainable, thriving organizational environment.
Yeah, I love that phrase in Timo Kuhn's definition of white supremacy is our relationship to time, how long things should take, your 90 days to your vision, all that crap. Sorry, Juliet, what comes up for you in disrupting white supremacy and supporting new leaders?
I think that idea of transparency about resources that are available is really important. Like, demystify it. Don't assume we know. Just if you could literally make a list, beautiful. So yeah, that's number one. And then maybe some support on how to access it as well. I think the other piece is, I think a lot of new leaders are really seeing organizing or social justice work as very holistic, mind, body, spirit, policy, and healing, right? Because like as a Latina leader, like I grew up, have been shaped by, and I'm still living in these oppressive systems, and my children are too, right? So my nervous system is shot, right? It is, and I am actively healing. And so just respect that this work is going to look different when we're leading it, because it has to be sustainable for our lives. It has to be, it's a part of our whole life, right? Like, it's not like I'm this work person and this other, right? Like, it's all, there's a holistic way of leading that I'm seeing in this generation of leaders. And so respect that. I've had a funder say like, oh, like, we don't, like, I just want to know about policy change. Like, I don't really, like, that's weird that you all are doing meditation or whatever. I'm like, really? Because so many of the young people I work with every day have to stand in a line where they have to take off their earrings and their belt to get through the metal detector into their school. And to tell me that you doing that for 4 years, for 200 days out of the year, doesn't have a harmful, oppressive effect on how you show up in the world and doesn't call for healing, then you don't know my community, right? And so how do you have the nerve to tell me that healing is not a part of this work? So respect the holistic way of working that you're seeing, I think, more leaders take on. And the other piece is this question of accountability, right? And I think I saw in the chat, it was like, accountability is not just a white supremacist. No, hell no. When I think about restorative and transformative justice, we're talking about a deeper sense of accountability, a commitment to each other, a commitment to struggle together and understanding together, and creating a presence that will build the future that we need together. And so the accountability that I'm talking about is first to my people. So understand that my leadership is accountable first to my community, then the board, then the funders. And if you expect something else from a leader that is supposed to be helping build a new world, and you first want them to think about the board and think about funders, like something's wrong in that equation, right? It must be our people, our community, because this literally is about freedom. Like, I mean, that's the only way that I could think about my job, right? Like, it's a job, it's weird, right? Like, and my job is to be a part of 500 years of resistance. And I get paid for that. And that's wild. And I can't even wrap my head around it, but that is how I see my work. So that's the accountability structure that I'm calling for.
That's exactly where we're going to leave it. I appreciate all three of you so very much for helping us reimagine the scope of executive transition, the kind of support it requires, and what it feels like to be going through that process. And hopefully that sensitizes and changes our mindsets no matter where we sit in the process, whether we're staff, board, incoming ED, outgoing ED, funder. That's how we make this look and feel different, I think, is all of us playing a part in that, changing our assumptions and expectations. Here's a heads up about next month's webinar. It's called Accounting for Equity. It's a new firm that's come together called Diverge, and they're going to help us think about how we express our values in the language of finance. So I'm really looking forward to that. And here it is, that time to clap for our presenters and make that commitment to complete this pop-up evaluation as I asked you at the beginning, so we can give them feedback, and more importantly, NPQ can incorporate your feedback. Juliet, Kiera, Liz, thank you so much for being here today and sharing your wisdom.